built my granddaughter a workshop with my own 2 hands, and on the morning I hung the last cabinet door, the snow was still coming down sideways across Lake Simcoe. 41 years I'd been a finished carpenter in this part of Ontario, and I'll tell you something. There's a particular quiet you only get standing inside a building you made yourself, when the heat's just kicked on and the wood's settling, and the windows are frosted up so you can't even see the road. That morning, I cried a little. Not a lot. I'm not that kind of man. But I stood in the middle of that workshop with sawdust still on my flannel, and I thought, this is the best thing I've ever made for anyone. The workshop sat on a half-acre I'd carved off my own property up near Beaverton, about 20 minutes from where my daughter's family was living in Brock Township. 940 square feet post and beam construction, all of it from a barn that came down in Uxbridge in 2019. Barnboard pine. Hand-hewn beams that probably went up before Confederation. You could see the broad axe marks if you ran your fingers along the underside. I'd had those beams stacked behind my garage for 4 years, drying, waiting. I didn't know what they were waiting for until my granddaughter Marlo turned 16 and told me, over Sunday dinner at my kitchen table, that she wanted to be a furniture maker. 16 years old, sitting there with her chipped black nail polish and her hair half tucked behind one ear, telling me she'd been watching videos on Japanese joinery at school during her spare period. My daughter rolled her eyes. I saw it. My son-in-law made some crack about how that wasn't a real career anymore, but Marlo just looked at me, and I looked at her, and I knew right then I was going to build that girl a shop. It took me 2 years and 7 months. I was 68 when I broke ground and 71 when I drove the last screw. My wife, God rest her, passed in the middle of the second winter, and I'll be honest, that workshop is half the reason I made it through. There were mornings I'd go out there at 5 a.m. just to be alone with the smell of cedar and the sound of my own planer. Marlo came up some weekends, especially after her grandmother died. We'd work side by side, not talking much. She'd sweep the shavings while I cut dados. She learned how to read a tape, how to set a hand plane, how to listen for the difference between dry pine and pine that still had moisture in it. She was good. She had patience, which most kids her age don't have, and she had an eye, which you can't teach. By the time I finished, she was 19 and starting her second year at Georgian College in their woodworking program up in Barrie. The workshop was meant to be her graduation present. I'd already had the surveyor out, already had the paperwork drawn up to sever the lot and gift it to her outright once she finished her diploma. The building itself was insured for $230,000, but that wasn't what it was worth. It was worth every Saturday I spent on my knees scribing baseboards. It was worth my wife bringing me coffee in February with a wool blanket over her shoulders. You can't put a number on that, except, as it turned out, you can. I'd planned a small thing for her 20th birthday, just family. My daughter Beth, my son-in-law Curtis, Marlo, and her older brother Jonah, who was 26 and working in finance down in Toronto. Beth wanted to do it at a restaurant in Aurelia, but I asked if we could do it at my place and have everyone come see the shop. I'd kept it locked. Marlo had been inside maybe a dozen times during construction, but she hadn't seen the finished interior. I'd installed the workbench the week before, 12 feet of laminated maple, 3 inches thick, built to take a beating for 50 years. I'd put a wood stove in the corner. There was a coffee station with a little kettle. I'd even built her a tool wall with pegs cut to the exact silhouette of every tool I was passing down to her. Chisels my own father gave me in 1979. A Stanley No. 4 plane I'd had since I was a kid. The day of the birthday it was bright and cold. The way late January gets up there, sun bouncing off of snow so hard it hurts your eyes. Beth and Curtis came up the driveway in their Audi. Jonah drove up separately with his girlfriend Priya, who I'd only met twice. Marlo drove herself in the little Subaru I'd helped her buy secondhand. I had a fire going inside the house and a tray of butter tarts from the bakery in Beaverton, because Marlo always loved them as a kid. We had lunch first. Beth had brought a salad and a bottle of white wine. Curtis kept checking his phone. Jonah and Priya were polite enough, but you could tell they'd rather have been anywhere else. Marlo sat next to me. She always did. After we ate, I stood up and tapped my glass. It was just water in mine. I don't drink anymore. and I said I had something to give her. I took the key out of my shirt pocket. It was a little brass key on a piece of leather cord I'd cut from an old tool belt of my father's. I told her, "Sweetheart, the shop's yours. Building, land, everything inside it. Happy birthday." Marlo started crying before I even got the key into her hand. She came around the table and hugged me so hard I felt hers shaking. I hugged her back, and I'll tell you, I felt my wife in that hug somehow, like she was standing right there. Then we all walked out to the workshop. I unlocked the door and stepped back to let Marlo go in first. She walked the perimeter slowly, touching things, running her hand along the workbench, looking up at the beams. She kept saying, "Grandpa," and starting to cry again and laughing through it. Priya was taking photos on her phone. Jonah stood by the door with his arms crossed. That's when Curtis spoke up. My son-in-law. Late 40s, started in commercial real estate in the early 2000s. Did fine for himself. Drives nicer cars than he can really afford. He looked around the workshop and he said, Wow, this is really something." And I thought, okay, maybe he's coming around. Maybe he sees what this means. Then he said, structurally, of course this is a shed, right? Like a really nice shed. But for what this acreage is worth, you might want to think about, the highest and best use. I didn't say anything. I was looking at Marlo, who had gone still. Beth, my own daughter, laughed nervously and said, "Curtis, come on." But Curtis kept going. He had that thing some men get when they think they're being the smart one in the room. He said the property could probably support a 4-bedroom build, that the lake views from the back corner were actually exceptional, that with a proper architect and the right builder, you could be looking at a $1.6, $1.7 million custom home easy. He said the workshop was charming, but it was, and these are his exact words, I'll never forget them, a bit of a vanity project for an old craftsman. A vanity project. I looked at Marlo. Her face was doing something I'd never seen before. Not anger. Embarrassment, almost, like her father had peed on the rug at a dinner party. She said quietly, "Dad, please." But Curtis just held up his hands and said he was only being practical. That Marlo was 20 years old and her career plans might change. And what would she do with this place if she ended up moving to Toronto or Vancouver in 5 years? Then Jonah, my own grandson, chimed in. He said, "Honestly, Grandpa, no offense, but the math here is kind of brutal. You sunk, 200 grand into a building that's adding maybe 90 to the appraised value? You'd be doing her a favor by selling the lot raw." Priya, his girlfriend, had stopped taking photos. Marlo wasn't crying anymore. She was just standing there in the middle of the shop. By the workbench I'd spent 4 months laminating, and she was looking at her father like she didn't know him. Curtis said, "Look, we love you, Grandpa. We love that you did this. But let's be real adults about it. If we sold the lot, even subdivided, kept your house, Marlo could walk away with maybe $450 after capital gains. That's a real start. That's a down payment in this market. That's something that actually sets her up. A shed full of old hand tools is a hobby. A $450 check is a future." He actually said Chet twice. I could feel my pulse in my jaw. 41 years of finish work, my wife's last winter, my father's chisels on the wall behind me. A shed. Marlo looked at me with these huge eyes and said, "Grandpa, I'd never." And I just put my hand on her shoulder and squeezed. I told everyone I needed a minute. I went back to the house. I stood in my kitchen with my hands on the counter, and I looked out the window at the workshop sitting there in the snow, and I thought about my wife, and I thought about what she would have said. She would have said, "Don't do anything stupid, love." So I didn't. Not that day. I went back out. I smiled. I cut the cake. I gave Marlo the key and told her in front of all of them that the shop was hers no matter what anyone else thought. Curtis at least had the decency to look uncomfortable. They left around 4. Marlo stayed an extra hour, sitting on the workbench, swinging her feet. Both of us just quiet. Before she left, she said, "Grandpa, I'm so sorry about Dad." I told her it wasn't her sorry to say. That night, I sat in my recliner, and I thought about it for a long time. The thing is, and I want to be clear about this, I wasn't angry at Marlowe. Not for 1 second. Marlowe had done nothing wrong. Marlowe loved that shop. But the shop wasn't going to be hers. Not really. Not the way I'd intended. Because as long as her father had any say, he was going to be in her ear about selling it, about highest and best use, about how much money she was leaving on the table. And eventually, in a year, in 5 years, in 10, she was going to give in, because that's what kids do when their parents wear them down. I'd seen it before. And I thought about something else. Curtis had been in commercial real estate for 20-some years. He knew exactly what that property was worth. He hadn't pulled those numbers out of the air. He'd already run them, probably more than once. Probably the minute he found out I was building a shop instead of a spec house. The next morning, I called my lawyer, a woman named Anja who'd handled my wife's estate and who I trusted more than I trust most people. I asked her to put the whole property, house, workshop, land, everything, on the market. I told her I wanted a quiet listing, no sign on the lawn, just word of mouth through the right realtor. I told her what I wanted to ask. She didn't blink. She said, "Are you sure?" I said I was sure. I said I'd already lost my wife, and I wasn't going to lose my granddaughter to her father's greed, and the only way to keep what I'd built clean was to take it out of his reach entirely. I called Marlowe that afternoon. I told her exactly what I was doing and exactly why. I told her she was getting every dollar I made on the sale in trust for her to use however she wanted. Workshop, school, business, house of her own, whatever. I told her I was sorry it had to be this way. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Grandpa, are you going to be okay?" That's what she said. Not, "What about my workshop?" Not, "Where will you live?" Just, "Are you going to be okay?" I told her I would be. The realtor, a man named Desmond out of an office in Lindsay, came up 2 days later. I walked him through everything. The septic, the well, the 400 feet of lake frontage I'd never even talked about because I'd never planned to sell. He went quiet when he saw the workshop. He's a guy who'd seen a lot of buildings. He stood inside it and he said, "Sir, I have to be honest with you. People are going to come from Toronto for this." I said, "Good." He listed it 3 weeks later, off-market, to a curated list of his clients. Asking was 1.49. We had 3 offers in the first 8 days. The winning offer was a couple from Forest Hill, both surgeons who wanted a weekend property and who walked through that workshop and cried. Actually cried, because the wife's father had been a furniture maker in Poland, and she said she wanted to keep the workshop exactly as it was, every tool, every peg, every chisel on the wall. They paid 1.53. After commissions and capital gains and the exemption on my principal residence, I cleared just over $1.2 million. $1,211,000 and change. I deposited the check on a Tuesday. Wednesday morning, I drove down to my lawyer's office and we set up the trust for Marlowe. Every dollar. Hers, with my daughter and son-in-law specifically named as excluded from any access or oversight. Ever. Anche made sure of it. Then I called my daughter. That phone call. I've replayed it in my head about 1,000 times. Beth picked up on the second ring. I told her I'd sold the property. There was about 4 full seconds of silence. Then she said, "What property?" I said, "All of it. The house, the lot, the workshop." She started talking very fast. Where was I going to live? Why hadn't I told her? Was I sick? Was this a scam? Had someone taken advantage of me? I let her go for a while. Then I said, "Beth, I sold it to make sure your husband couldn't pressure your daughter into selling it later." That's when it got bad. Curtis got on the phone within about 90 seconds. There's no other word. He was unhinged. He was shouting about elder abuse, about cognitive decline, about how I had no right to make a unilateral financial decision without family consultation. He said the words power of attorney and capacity assessment in the same sentence. He said his lawyer would be in touch. He said I had betrayed my own family. He said, and this is the part I think about most, he said, you realize you've stolen from your own grandchildren. I almost laughed. I said, Curtis, every dollar is in trust for Marlo. Every single dollar. You couldn't touch it if you tried, and I know you'll try. He hung up on me. The lawyer's letter arrived a week later, a firm out of Toronto, expensive letterhead, threatening litigation on grounds of undue influence on the buyers, breach of fiduciary duty to family, and asking for a full accounting of the disposition of family assets. Anche wrote back the same afternoon. 2 pages. Cold and precise. She pointed out that the property had been mine, solely, free and clear, that no family member had any legal or equitable interest in it, that I had been declared of sound mind in a capacity assessment I had voluntarily completed 2 days before listing. Anche had insisted on that, smart woman, and that any further correspondence on the matter would be considered harassment. She invited their lawyer to advise his clients accordingly. Their lawyer must have advised them, because the second letter never came. What came instead was Beth at my new place, a 3-bedroom bungalow I'd bought in a 55-plus community outside Lindsay. She showed up on a Saturday afternoon in March. No warning. She'd been crying. She sat at my kitchen table, and she said, Dad, I don't know who you are anymore. She said I'd torn the family apart over a misunderstanding. She said Curtis was just trying to be helpful, that he'd phrased things badly, that I'd overreacted. She asked if I would consider, and these are her words, unwinding the trust and putting some of the money back into the family where it belonged. I told her no. She cried harder. She said Jonah was getting married in the fall, and the wedding was costing them $70,000, and Curtis's commission income had been bad for 2 years, and they were stretched thin, and the money would have made an enormous difference. I told her I was sorry to hear it, but the answer was no. The money was Marlo's. It had always been meant for Marlo. It was just in a different form now. Beth said, What about Jonah? You only love one grandchild? I told her, and I tried to say this gently, I told her that I loved both of my grandchildren equally, but only one of them had ever once asked me about my work. Only one had sat in my shop and learned to sharpen a chisel. Only one had cried at her grandmother's funeral and cleaned out my wife's closet with me afterwards, because she knew I couldn't do it alone. I told her Jonah was a fine young man, but he had made his choices about who to be in this family, and Curtis had made his, and so had she, by sitting silent in that workshop on Marlo's birthday while her husband called her own father's life work a vanity project. That's when Beth got quiet. She didn't argue with that part. She knew it was true. She left without hugging me. That hurt. I won't pretend it didn't. The next 6 months were hard. Marlo came every Sunday, sometimes with a friend from school. We'd go to a little diner I'd found in town, then come back and watch hockey. She didn't touch the trust money, not for over a year. She finished her diploma. She rented a small space in an industrial bay in Barrie and started taking commissions. She paid for it out of her own savings on principal. The trust just sat there earning interest. Curtis didn't speak to me for 8 months. Beth called sporadically, mostly when she wanted to test the waters about the money. The answer was always no. Eventually, she stopped asking and started actually talking to me again, the way a daughter is supposed to talk to her father. It wasn't the same. I don't know if it ever will be. But it was something. Jonah got married in October. I went to the wedding. Curtis didn't speak to me directly, but he didn't stop me from being there either. Marlo walked in with me and sat next to me at the family table, and that's all that mattered. About a year after I sold the property, Marlo came to me with a proposal. She had it written up like a business plan, the way they teach them to do at college now. She wanted to use about $120,000 from the trust to buy a small commercial building on the main street in Beaverton, an old hardware store that had closed during the pandemic. She wanted to convert it into a furniture shop and teaching studio. 2 days a week, she'd take students. The other days, she'd build commissions. She had projections, lease comparables, the whole thing. She'd done her homework, I helped her with the renovation. I was 72 by then and slower than I used to be, but I still knew my way around a saw. We built the workbenches together, 8 of them for students. We salvaged the old hardware store's pressed tin ceiling and refinished it. Marlo named the shop after my wife, her grandmother, without telling me. I didn't know until the sign went up. I cried in the parking lot when I saw it. I'm not above admitting that. Last summer, my great-granddaughter was born, Jonah and Priya's little girl. Beth called and asked if I'd like to come meet her. I drove down to Toronto for the day. Curtis was there, of course. He shook my hand at the door. Stiffly, but he shook it. We didn't say much to each other. I held the baby. She had Jonah's mouth and her grandmother's nose. My Beth, I mean. Beth as a baby. I'd forgotten how that nose looked until I saw it on a new face. When I left, Curtis walked me to my truck. He stood there for a long time with his hands in his pockets. Then he said, I shouldn't have called it a shed. That was it. That was all he said. He didn't apologize. He didn't take it back. Not really. But he said that one sentence, and I understood that for him, that was probably as close as he was ever going to get. I told him, no, you shouldn't have. And I got in my truck and I drove home. Marlo's shop is in its 3rd year now. She's got more commissions than she can handle. She hires students part-time. The workbench I built for her on her 20th birthday is in the front window of the studio. The surgeon's wife from Forest Hill called Marlo it last spring and asked if she'd like to have it back. Just gave it to her. Drove it up herself in a U-Haul. That's the kind of person buys a place like that. The workshop, the rest of it, is still standing exactly as I built it. The surgeon's wife sends me a Christmas card every year with a photo of the wood stove burning. She signs it, from the caretakers. I'm 73 this winter. I live in a smaller house than the one I built my life in. I miss the lake. I miss my wife every single day, but I sleep at night, and I built that girl a workshop, and when my time comes, there's going to be a place on the main street in Beaverton, with my wife's name on the door and my granddaughter's hands inside it, building things that will last past all of us. A vanity project. That's what he called it. It's the truest thing I ever made. I've thought about that birthday 1,000 times since, and I keep coming back to one thing. The moment my son-in-law called my workshop a shed, he wasn't really insulting a building. He was telling me, plainly and without meaning to, exactly who he was and exactly what he believed had value in this world. And once a man tells you that, you'd better listen. Because everything that comes after follows from it as surely as winter follows fall. That's the law I've lived by, and it never lies. What we say comes from what we are, and what we do comes from what we say, and what we end up with at the end of our lives comes from what we've done. Curtis valued numbers on a page. So he ended up with numbers on a page, and not much else from me. Marlo valued the work of human hands, and the patience it takes to learn a craft, and the love that gets poured into a thing built slow. So she ended up with a workshop, and a trust, and a shop on the main street, with her grandmother's name above the door. The world gave each of them what they had asked for. I just held the door open. I think a lot of folks my age get bitter near the end. They feel cheated by their children, betrayed by changing times, sour about the world's drift away from the things they understood. I won't lie and say I never feel that pull, but I learned something through all this, and I'd offer it plain to anyone listening. Character isn't an inheritance. You don't pass it down by writing it into a will. You pass it down by what you build and who you let stand beside you while you're building it. Marlo stood beside me. Jonah didn't. That was nobody's choice but theirs, and the consequences of that choice were not mine to soften. There were 3 things I had to find inside myself to get through that year, and I'd want my great-granddaughter to know them when she's older. The first was the moral spine to do what was right, even when it cost me my daughter's affection for a long while. The second was the wisdom to see clearly, to not confuse love with capitulation, to not mistake silence for peace. And the third was the plain stubbornness to keep going. To pick up the phone again when Beth was ready. To shake Curtis's hand at the door even when I didn't want to. To drive down and hold a baby who had her grandmother's nose, even when part of me wanted to stay angry forever. A man who builds with his own hands knows that nothing worth keeping comes out of a single afternoon. Houses settle. Wood moves. Joints loosen and need to be checked. Families are no different. I didn't fix everything. I won't in the years I've got left, but I held the line where it mattered, and I made sure my granddaughter wouldn't be punished for someone else's appetite. And I taught her, by what I did, not by what I said, that her work means what she says it means, and nobody else gets to put a price on it. That's the only inheritance I ever cared about leaving.